And I think we've pointed to all of the potential directions that this crisis, this poly crisis, could go in. And of course, each of those possible scenarios, which are going to play out in days and weeks at the most, carry with them their own set of new poly crisis consequences. And I think that if people are feeling unsure and anxious about where things are headed, it's not a bad frame of mind to be in.
Welcome, everybody, back to the Heroes Path podcast and our Heroes Path brief. I'm Colonel John Fenzel. Today's episode is different. We're going to do three things, and I want to tell you why all three matter together. First, I'm going to talk to you about a word, polycrisis. If you don't know that word yet, you need to. It's the single most accurate term for what is happening in the world right now, and understanding that concept is the first step toward acting effectively inside it. Second, Jeff Steinberg is going to take us through a historical episode that most people have forgotten, but that maps directly into what we're living through today, the 1956 Suez Crisis. How a fight over a waterway nearly triggered World War III, how it ended an empire, and why the parallels to 2026 aren't metaphorical at all, they're structural. And third, we're going to give you the ground truth on what's happening right now with Iran, the Straits of Hormuz, just as we've been doing for the last 7-8 weeks, and the talks that will determine whether the ceasefire holds past April 22nd. Jeff Steinberg, thanks again for being with us.
Pleasure always, John.
Well, this is an interesting week, and we're going to get into all those headlines. But before we do that, I want to talk directly to our audience for just a few minutes, if that's okay, Jeff, because I think that the single most useful thing that I can do today is just give you something that frames all of this. If you've been feeling confused lately, as probably we all are, as though everything is hitting you all at once, I want you to know that this isn't a personal or private experience. It's actually a collective experience. And by the way, those aren't my words. They belong to a guy by the name of Adam Tooze. He's a Columbia historian. And in 2022, he wrote a Financial Times column that was titled "Welcome to the World of Polycrisis." And that gave a name to the thing that had been gnawing at the edge of public consciousness since at least 2020. But I want to be clear about what polycrisis means, because most people hear it and they think, oh, it just means a lot of bad things happening at the same time. Well, that's not true. It doesn't. There's a lot of bad things at the same time. That's a bad year. A polycrisis is a different kind of problem. So the key phrase there is causal entanglement, not coincidence, not bad luck, but entanglement, where each crisis actually makes the others worse through feedback loops that cross all system boundaries. Now, let me just show you what this looks like in practice, not in theory, but today, Friday, April 17th, 2026. We can start with COVID. The pandemic shut down the world economy. So trust in institutions already were declining, and then they collapsed. And that collapse of trust produced the political conditions for leaders who promised to tear those institutions down. And some of them did. Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022 with their full-scale invasion. It was the largest land war in Europe since 1945. The Western response, for all of its imperfections, was substantial. Coordinated sanctions, billions in military aid, and a degree of alliance solidarity that, quite frankly, surprised Moscow. That response was the institutional architecture working: NATO, the transatlantic relationship, the network of alliances built over 75 years at the time. Now it's been 81 years. It didn't end the war, but it prevented Ukraine from falling back in weeks, which is what most intelligence assessments predicted. Now, look what's happened to the architecture since then. In January 2025, the current administration froze virtually all foreign aid. By February, USAID, the primary instrument of American development and humanitarian influence abroad, had its headquarters closed and its workforce placed on administrative leave. And then by January, 94% of its staff had been laid off and 83% of its programs canceled. The agency helped eradicate smallpox and prevented millions of HIV cases. All that was dissolved. And then in March of 2025, the administration froze military aid to Ukraine. the ammunition, the air defense systems, HIMARS, rockets that held the line were held back. Ukrainian officials called it a black day. The Kremlin called it cause for modest optimism. Simultaneously, the president cast public doubt on Article 5, which is the mutual defense commitment that is the foundation of NATO. European allies began openly questioning whether American security guarantees meant anything at all. Ukraine war funding may run dry by June of this year, just 2 months away. China has been the clear winner of this sequence, which is a bit ironic. While the West exhausted diplomatic capital and the military inventory, which we've talked about over the last 6 weeks on Ukraine, and then turned it to Iran. Beijing deepened its economic ties with Russia. Bilateral trade hit $240 billion, consolidated its technological self-sufficiency, ran the most expensive military exercise in the Taiwan Straits in history, and watched its principal competitors weaken themselves from within. So that's not an accident. That's what a polycrisis looks like from the perspective of the power that didn't create it. Meanwhile, the multi-level institutions that were designed to manage these crises, like Iran's nuclear program, the IAEA, the UN Security Council, non-proliferation frameworks, they've all been defunded, sidelined, or vetoed into irrelevance. And when those institutions fail to constrain Iran's enrichment, the response was not to rebuild them, it was to launch a war. That war closed the Straits of Hormuz. That's where we are today. And that oil shock is now embedded in your mortgage rates, in your gas prices, and in your supply chains. None of these links were inevitable. Each one was a choice or a failure to choose, but each one made the next link more likely. And that's what a polycrisis is, not a sequence of bad luck, but a system where every crisis degrades the capacity to respond to the next one. I'll stop there. There's lots more to talk about, but when you hear the word polycrisis, understand it's not a buzzword. It's the most precise diagnosis, I believe, for this moment that we're in today. And the reason we've spent time on it this morning is that if you don't have that frame, you can't see the pattern. And if you can't see the pattern, you'll treat each crisis, Iran, Ukraine, Taiwan, inflation, the trade war, the hollowing out of these institutions as separate problems. And they're not separate. They're entangled, and that entanglement is the thing. Jeff, I think we'll stop there. I've talked long enough, but it brings us to you. What are your impressions about all of this?
Yeah, I think that it's very precise. In fact, in 2025, polycrisis was the actual theme for the entire annual World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, Switzerland. And we're in a moment right now where every American, when they go shopping, when they go to the gas pump, they're experiencing the consequences of what's going on in the Middle East. 6 months from now, farmers facing shortages of fertilizer because of the shutdown of the Straits of Hormuz are going to be having difficulty bringing their full load of crops to market. So the IMF is meeting in Washington this week, and they're saying that we're probably on the verge of a global recession, singularly as the result of the events going on in the Middle East. If you're a Chinese multi-billionaire or a Russian tech expert, you're no longer thinking about buying a condo in Dubai, which a few months ago was thought of as about the safest place on earth for wealth to concentrate. So I think this polycrisis concept is really relevant. Probably the most consequential example, if someone were to look back at a historical moment from the vantage point of polycrisis, would be the circumstances under which the First World War broke out.
Yeah, I was just going to say, this sounds an awful lot like World War I. That was another polycrisis, wasn't it? And all it took was
Exactly.
one assassin to spark it all.
Yep. And we don't know whether historians 5 years from now are going to look back and describe this moment as the launch point of World War III.
Yeah, I hope not. But that brings us to the next segment, which I think directly relates, because when we were having breakfast last week in West Palm Beach, we talked about this, and we just said if people could just look at our history and understand kind of events that run in parallel to this, the one that comes to mind is the Suez Crisis. And you've done extensive research on this. And so that's why I really think it would be valuable if you could talk a little bit about the Suez Crisis and those parallels.
Well, I think it's important to remember that in a very short, compressed period of time in the middle of 1956, you had three events going on simultaneously. The British, the French, and the Israelis, in response to Egyptian President Nasser announcing the nationalization of the Suez Canal, invaded and basically presumed to permanently take over control of that vital strategic waterway. Today, we're talking not only about the shutdown of the Straits of Hormuz, but the possibility that if the war resumes again, the Iranians, in conjunction with the Houthis, may shut down the access point to the Red Sea and effectively form a blockade on the Suez Canal as well. So, but in 1956, you had the British, French, and Israeli invasion of Suez. You had the outbreak of the Hungarian Revolution and the Soviet decision to send in tanks to suppress it. And all of these events were going on the eve of the 1956 presidential elections, where President Eisenhower was seeking re-election to a second term. I think it's critical to remember two things. Number one, we don't think of Eisenhower as an FDR man, but there was very much a kind of echo of Eisenhower's experience during World War II as Franklin Roosevelt's commander-in-chief of the entire European theater. And so Eisenhower inherited some of Roosevelt's disdain for the European colonial and imperial powers, which were hoping to restore things to where they were before the outbreak of World War II after the war ended. And Roosevelt wanted to have nothing of that. Now, a little bit of historical background on Suez. In 1953, Eisenhower was committed upon his presidential election to bringing an end to the Korean War. It was one of his fundamental campaign pledges. He went to Korea in December of 1952 after his election, but before his inauguration, and made it clear to Syngman Rhee and to others that the war was going to come to an end very quickly. He didn't make any outrageous pledges that he'd finish it in one day or with one phone call. He did the hard work that was required to bring about the armistice, which occurred in July of 1953. The British had their own problem to deal with, which was namely the election of Mossadegh in Iran. And as the result of that, Mossadegh announced plans to nationalize the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. In other words, to take back sovereign control over Iran's oil from a British company that had been basically the number one beneficiaries. The British wanted to overthrow Mossadegh in 1953, but didn't want a British footprint on it. And the British were still reeling from World War II and didn't necessarily have the resources to follow through. They wanted the CIA. And Eisenhower originally said, no, there's no U.S. interest here. In fact, the United States views Mossadegh as a kind of an interesting character, somebody who fits the mold of a potentially viable partner nationalist leader, even though Eisenhower was a staunch anti-communist. The British said, well, if you don't help us to overthrow Mossadegh, we're going to announce the withdrawal of all British forces from Korea, and that's going to bring an end to your efforts to bring the war to an end. The Chinese, the Soviets, the North Koreans, they're going to say, hey, if the British are out, then this is a sign of a weakening resolve, and we're going to keep fighting.
Hey, Jeff,
So Eisenhower
just quickly, that's not generally known. I've never read that in any history books at all.
I was given that account by a longtime friend who at the time was on the staff of Admiral Arleigh Burke. And he was privy to exactly what the behind the scenes fight was. And so where that leads us is in 1956, Eisenhower, who did begrudgingly go along with letting the CIA get in on the Mossadegh coup, even though it was really a prelude to what we're going through right now. the idea that a legitimately elected government of Iran was overthrown by Western powers, namely the US and the British, carries a long wave impact on the mindset of the population of Iran. And so basically, in 56, Eisenhower got his revenge. And he just put his foot down and told the British, the French, and the Israelis to get out. I had an Egyptian friend, a journalist in Washington, D.C., who was a kid at the time. And he said Eisenhower's picture was hanging in his family home living room because Eisenhower was considered a hero for clearly distinguishing between American foreign policy in the Middle East and the European colonial powers plus Israel. And so basically, the other element of that story was Hungary. Eisenhower had very early on in his presidency developed a planning group, and it was called the Solarium Project. And they developed a long-term strategy for how to fight and win the Cold War while avoiding a nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union. And so in 1956, against enormous pressure within his own cabinet, Eisenhower said, we are not going to intervene into the Hungary crisis. There were people in the Pentagon promoting the idea that the U.S. should be ready to go to nuclear war with the Soviet Union over the events that were taking place in Hungary. And Eisenhower basically said, no, we've developed a long-term strategy. Our strategy is to defeat the Soviet Union over a long period of time through containment and through basically relying on the fact that their entire communist system was internally flawed and would ultimately die a slow death of its own internal failures. And so he rejected the pressure to bring the United States directly into war with the Soviet Union over Hungary at the same time that he was telling our ostensible NATO allies from Europe that the United States was not going to back their colonial adventures in the Middle East. So this was an act of political leadership that not only changed the face of Middle East politics for quite a long time, it basically defined the framework for how the United States would avoid major confrontation with the Soviet Union, while at the same time essentially containing Soviet expansion. We really balked at directly intervening in Hungary, and at the same time did directly intervene diplomatically in the Suez Crisis. So, it's another one of those moments where the concept of polycrisis perfectly fits the bill and at the same time gives us a sort of a framework and a historical background for looking at these tumultuous events in the Middle East and how they're playing out globally today. We have a Middle East crisis, but we also have the ongoing effort to bring an end to the Russia-Ukraine war in some way that restores stability to that whole Eastern European theater. And so, again, we've got the same two geographies intersecting in simultaneous crises. The expending of the weaponry in the Middle East virtually guarantees that whether we'd like to or not, the equipment's not there to provide to Ukraine, period. They're offsetting
Well,
it
or
with
for that matter, a protection
Well,
of the Taiwan Straits.
well, the Chinese are looking very clearly at what's going on in the Middle East, and it's going to very much frame things. And of course, on May 14th, President Trump's scheduled to be in Beijing for an extremely important summit meeting with China, where one of the issues on the table is whether or not we're going to be in a kind of economic war with China or whether there's going to be some sort of a rapprochement at the same time that we're looking at China as the more long-term and serious challenge to the United States from both the military, but particularly an economic standpoint.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, there's so many different parallels here. One of the parallels is the fact that you had Britain, France, and Israel secretly colluding together with Suez in their response to that. And they do this without telling the Americans at all, right? I mean, that's That's one thing that
Exactly.
happened. And then you look at the situation that you were mentioning. It's almost like the tables have been completely turned. And today you have the Americans doing everything unilaterally and then after the fact saying, NATO, you need to join us in this effort, which they have completely discarded as even a concept.
You've got even some significant breaks. Both Britain and Italy are really in President Trump's crosshairs right now. Prime Minister Meloni in Italy just announced that they're not going to be automatically renewing their strategic partnership with Israel. They're going to put it under review because of things like Gaza and the ongoing current Lebanon war and the Israeli role, whether it was instigator, initiator, or fellow traveler with Trump in terms of the Iran war.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
We've even threatened to invade the Vatican. So,
exactly. Yes.
here's another parallel is that in 1956, you had a critical maritime choke point that had been weaponized. And then here we have the same thing with the Straits of Hormuz, also weaponized. Both carry a disproportionate share of global energy supplies. Both became a central strategic leverage point of the crisis. So I think it's a direct parallel.
Absolutely. And we're just to bring things up to the moment, we're in I think the best way to characterize it is that we're in a pause moment right now. You've got two sets of negotiations going on during a period of a temporary ceasefire. As you said, the U.S. Iran agreement ceasefire expires on the 22nd. The administration is saying that there's enough progress in the diplomacy to warrant an extension of that. And at a lengthy conversation with a very senior Israeli strategist just yesterday, and he emphasized that the only circumstances under which Netanyahu would even agree to that 10-day ceasefire in Lebanon was under direct pressure from the U.S. It's the only thing that would have any impact on Netanyahu and force him to take that pause. And so we're really at a kind of an inflection point now where either there's going to be a resolution, a diplomatic endpoint in which both the United States and Iran have to make some compromises, while at the same time both sides have to be able to come out and claim victory
Yeah.
for their own internal audience. And Israel could be either the spoiler, or if Trump, and I think I said this last week, the big unanswered question was how much of a foot would the Trump administration put down on Israel, whose objectives are nothing short of absolute regime change in Iran.
Well, here's the next parallel that I was going to mention is that it may be the most important parallel because Eden's goal in 1956 was to knock Nasser off of his perch. Those are his words.
Right.
And he was defeated militarily. Egypt lost its air force, its army in the Sinai, but the forced withdrawal transformed a military defeat into a political triumph for Nasser, didn't it? And so I just read a quote from Richard Haas, who is the former president, of course, of Council on Foreign Relations. And he had something really interesting to say. He said, while Iran lost its conventional measures of war, it's emerging as a strategic winner. And then he went on to say that regimes that survive superpower military campaigns don't just survive, they're immunized. And so you have that domestic narrative of the war itself. We absorb the full weight of American air power, and we're still here. It's not a talking point at all. That's a founding myth for the next generation of Iranian nationalism.
Right. And of course, that Iranian nationalism always invokes Mossadegh, always invokes the fact that you had a legitimately and, quote, democratically elected leader of that country who was taking certain revolutionary steps on behalf of the population, namely putting the resources of their vast oil sector to use for the country rather than as an exploitative thing from a British company that was a legacy of the old colonial period. And so these things all tend to tie together when you look at a sense of national identity, national pride, culture, and history. And so, in a certain sense, the fruits of 1953 and the fruits of 1978, 79 are what's playing out now.
Yeah.
Remember, Khomeini wasn't put in power by the Soviets or by the communist Chinese. He was residing outside of Paris and was basically brought back in on the grounds that the Carter administration had created a new foreign policy for the United States in which human rights was a kind of a centerpiece. So the 1978, 79 revolution was something that was encouraged from the West initially. I'm sure we didn't envision the outcome. We didn't really think that it would be something that came to be so dominated by a theocracy and by the Iran, the Revolutionary Guard. But we're dealing with the long wave consequences of our own decisions. So in a sense, you've got to take that polycrisis concept and look at it on a timeline as well as a sort of a snapshot.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, Jeff, there's so many other parallels that I can think of. As you had mentioned, the Suez Crisis was the moment that ended the British Empire. And then also another thing that comes into mind is that in 1956, you had a mediator who came from an unexpected quarter, and that was Lester Pearson of Canada. And this year, for this crisis, it's Pakistan. Whoever would have even thought that Pakistan would have emerged as this diplomatic powerhouse that was mediating everything, and here we are. The other parallel that I can think of is the rise of the next power, and you had just mentioned this, and Suez accelerated America's replacement, as you mentioned, of Britain as the dominant power in the Middle East. You had the Eisenhower Doctrine that followed within just months of the Suez Crisis. But today, arguably, the beneficiary is China. And so there are so many different parallels to this, and I'm not sure. I know this administration isn't looking at it in those terms, but they should. And so here we are.
Yeah, Pakistan is interesting because if you just look at the concise timeline, you had a meeting in Islamabad with the foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, and Pakistan. And by consensus of that group, the very next day, the Pakistani foreign minister flew to Beijing and got the Chinese sort of implicit backing for Pakistani mediation. And Pakistan borders Iran, and therefore, since they have certain common security challenges like the Baluchi separatists in both countries, Pakistan proved to be a perfect channel to basically engage with the United States, with the regional Sunni powers, and with Iran, with the strength of China backing them up. So it's the way the cards are being laid out on the table here that is constantly shifting, and Pakistan may prove to be the sort of mediator that brought this crisis to an end. You're right. It's against all odds.
It's a bit surreal. In 2006, I think it wasn't that the 50th anniversary of Suez, and you had, again, Council on Foreign Relations panel that was happening, and the historian David Fromkin, he was asked, what is the big lesson of the Suez crisis? And his simple response was, don't lie. Do you think that lesson was learned?
Inshallah.
So there's a lot of things that we could learn about all of this, Jeff, but I think that in the interest of brevity, and we can get into this next week as well. Actually, I'm going to be in England, so I'm not sure we'll be able to do this next week, but we can talk about it whenever we're able to reconvene on this. But let's talk a little bit about Iran and where we are right now. You've got the negotiations, you have the Straits of Hormuz, you have the Lebanese ceasefire, the humanitarian situation. Can you just give us a quick snapshot on where we're at?
Well, yeah, I think very often wars come to an end on the basis of an absolute victory by one side or the other. That's not the situation here. Sometimes they end by mutual exhaustion. And I think that the blockade that the U.S. Navy has imposed just over the last few days has the potential to have a very significant impact on Iran and create an incentive, even in the minds of some of the hardline Revolutionary Guard people, to bring this thing to an end. An estimate I've received is that if this blockade continues, it will cost the Iranian economy about $13 billion a month. At the same time, there are consequences that are pretty serious on the U.S. side as well. Namely, with elections coming up in November, clearly inflation has returned with a vengeance. And the most clear and obvious immediate symbol of that is that people are paying $1 more plus a gallon for gasoline. And we don't even have an assessment yet of the long-term damage to the Gulf Arab countries. We know Qatar's ability to continue to produce and ship out gas, LNG around the world has been greatly reduced. We don't know the extent to which Saudi, Kuwait, other places have felt the heat. The UAE, which had the closest relationship to Israel, being a member of the Abraham Accords and other things, has been probably hit the hardest. And we're going to be bearing the consequences of this for some time. Yesterday, Russell Vought, the head of the Office of Management and Budget, appeared up on the Senate and refused to give a cost estimate of the war because it's an enormous embarrassment to the administration. And there's domestic political consequences. If the Democrats win by a large margin and wind up taking the majority back in the House and even less likely in the Senate, then President Trump is a lame duck from the standpoint of getting anything through Congress. He may basically say, I'm the president, I'm the commander in chief, and I'm going to do everything by unilateral decision in the executive branch. So we could be seeing another stage of a constitutional crisis overlapping with major economic problems. And of course, the Europeans have made it clear that they subscribe to Colin Powell's view. If you break it, you own it, and don't try to rent it out to us after the walls have all been torn down and expect us to basically open up the Straits of Hormuz. But at the same time, Europe is getting clobbered economically, worse than even the United States.
So we might see pottery barns popping up around Europe right now.
Exactly.
Hey, so Jeff, the ceasefire expires on April 22nd. That's just 5 days from now. So what are the scenarios? Scenario one is that you have an interim deal that's reached, both sides agree. Scenario two, which I think is probably the most likely, ceasefire is extended without a deal, because now you've got Turkey that's suggesting 45 to 60 days extension. Pakistan is also pushing for that. That's just the status quo being extended. It's fragile, it's combustible, but not catastrophic. Oil stays where it's at, between $95 and $100. Then you have a third scenario, and that's where the ceasefire just totally collapses, talks fail, the naval blockade escalates, Iran retaliates, oil goes up to $120 minimum, and the Fed's hands are tied. And then also you'll see mortgage rates climbing further. That's back to an acute stage of this crisis with nuclear dimensions and really no off-ramp in sight. Which scenario do you assess is probably the most likely?
Most likely one is an extension, again, because I think that there are consequences for both the Iranians and the Gulf Arabs in the United States on the other side, and Israel, that are pretty harsh. If we don't get to a deal, and as I understand it, the Iranians are prepared to accept that 440 kilos of highly enriched up to 60% uranium, they're prepared under IAEA supervision to have that reduced back down to 3 to 5% and to have basically a 10-year moratorium on new enrichment, which would give them nominally the right to enrich theoretically, but an agreement to place strong limits on it. Some arrangement in which Iran is given acknowledged limited sovereignty over parts of the Straits of Hormuz in conjunction with Oman. So the framework for a deal that could satisfy everybody and give all sides the ability to claim some level of victory is there as a potentiality. And those are some of the specifics that are on the table right now. I think one of the other things to bear in mind in terms of your third scenario is that if these talks break down and if the actual combat resumes, with both sides having had a couple of weeks to just take a breather and replenish, and the Iranians are digging up a lot of the sites that were bombed, but where the equipment that was targeted, the mobile launchers and things like that, weren't necessarily destroyed. They were just taken temporarily out of action. So we don't know what kind of position the Iranians would be in. But if the fighting resumes, then I think there's no end game alternative to this going all the way to a full regime change, which is what the Israelis have wanted from the beginning. And if that happens, then some degree of ground ops are going to be a part of that equation. And then we're really off to the races.
Yeah.
Then we're
Well,
looking at a war that has every potential to go into a global confrontation. What do Russia and China do in those consequences? I think, again, those things argue that if there's any degree of rationality on both the US and Iranian sides, and then by extension on the Israeli side, this thing has to come to an end soon. Otherwise, the consequences are going to really vector in the direction of world war, and with the constant potentiality for nuclear exchange.
yeah. And it'd be tempting to think, oh, that's overly dramatic, but it's really not. And that's why we even talked about the Suez Crisis, because we came that close to a nuclear confrontation during the Suez Crisis in 1956. And here we are in 2026, and we're facing about the same, even more devastating consequences if we allow it to
Right.
continue. So let's bring this home. We opened with polycrisis, the concept that these crises aren't separate, but they're entangled, and each one it degrades the capacity to respond to the next. And Jeff, you just walked us through Suez, how a fight through a waterway in 1956 nearly triggered a world war, ended an empire, and then taught lessons that we apparently haven't learned. And we gave you the current state of place. So what do you do with all this? I'm not going to tell you to stockpile fuel or move your savings into gold. The people who say these things are usually selling something. What I will tell you is what the structural history demands. Islamabad talks resume soon. The ceasefire has just 5 days left. The time to make decisions is not after the outcome is clear. It's now. If you own a business, understand that your energy exposure at current prices, not the prices from February. If you have contracts expiring, renegotiate them with reality. If you're borrowing, budget for current rates through year end. The mortgage market that existed in February is not the market that you're going to be borrowing in today. When systems are under stress, simple explanations gain enormous appeal. You can blame outsiders, you can blame strongmen leadership, you can retreat into nationalism. There's a lot of different things that you'll see. The common factor in every historical catastrophe, whether it's Suez, the interwar period, 1914 that we mentioned, is the failure of institutional frameworks. Institutions fail slowly and then suddenly. The erosion we've documented today, USAID being gutted, NATO undermined, arms control treaties expired, the IAEA locked out. It's not incidental to the polycrisis. It's part of this polycrisis. And the fourth thing is, and Jeff, you and I have both served in environments where the information was incomplete and the decisions couldn't wait. The leaders worth following were never the ones with the best information. They were the ones who could hold genuine uncertainty without faking confidence that they didn't have while making the next decision clearly. And that's exactly what this moment is testing. And we talked about this in West Palm Beach. What got us through Suez? It was leadership. It was Eisenhower's leadership. And so here we are today, right? There's going to be a lot more information that follows. Jeff, anything else that you wanted to add to that?
No, I think that kind of sums it up quite nicely. And we're, as I say, we're in a pause. And I think we've pointed to all of the potential directions that this crisis, this polycrisis, could go in. And of course, each of those possible scenarios, which are going to play out in days and weeks at the most, carry with them their own set of new polycrisis consequences. And I think that if people are feeling unsure and anxious about where things are headed, it's not a bad frame of mind to be in.
It's the only one that I can really think of. That there's another acronym, VUCA, volatile, uncertain, chaotic, I can't remember, ambiguous. I think
Yep,
that applies
that's-
here too, but it's not quite as precise as polycrisis. But this isn't just a Middle East story. And let me just try to wrap this up here. It's a system story. It's about what happens when energy and war and diplomacy, nuclear risk, and then economic fragility collide inside a system that has lost the institutional capacity to manage any one of them. So, Jeff, thanks so much again for helping us see this pattern, not just the event. And to our listeners, stay informed, stay grounded, and don't confuse noise for signal. I'm John Fenzel. Thanks for listening to the Heroes Path podcast and the Heroes Path Brief. Have a good weekend. Thanks, Jeff.
My pleasure, John.